What's going on, world? It's Bruce Poinsett, and today I'm doing a little public scripture reading from the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. For those who don't know, the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop is an offshoot of my program, Some Shit I Read, which you can subscribe to on YouTube. But anyways, Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop is a little weekly reading I do from the book Can't Stop, Won't Stop by Jeff Chang, the history of the hip hop generation. And I wanted to do just a little public reading and really PSA today from a passage, a little excerpt on hip hop or the hip hop generation and that era's relation to the opposing apartheid in South Africa. And really, I call it a PSA because it's kind of a reminder of, where we've been and where we can go if we expand the scope of our organizing and start connecting some of these dots. So I'm gonna read that for you now. In one important respect, the student movement of the 1980s was very different from that of the 60s. Students of color played a central organizing and demand-making role. During the 1960s, organizations led by young people of color, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panthers, and the Third World Studies coalitions at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, had lent moral weight to the new left. But white males had always dominated the student movement's leadership. Even the student anti-apartheid movement at the beginning had been led mainly by white students. By the mid-1980s, students of color were no longer marginal. Students of color led the protest at pivotal campuses like Yale, Rutgers, Stanford, and UC Berkeley. Columbia University's Coalition for a Free South Africa had emerged in 1981 as the campus Black student organization. On many other campuses where whites led the anti-apartheid movement, a process of painful self-critique, often initiated by students of color, began to emerge. Most white radical liberal types came to the apartheid movement out of empathy abroad and the feeling like they do something to support, says Pedro Nogueira. We had people from the Black fraternities and sororities, a real cross-section of students. We were trying to make links between issues facing people of color in the United States and on the campus and the struggle in Africa. The white students didn't see those connections so clearly. With students of color, we made that connection real clear. Apartheid gave the students of color a frame to understand the power of whiteness, not only in South Africa, but in the institution and in the movement. They also began to critique the failures of the baby boomer generation. While desegregation had given the new activists a place on the university campus, they still found few professors and administrators of color, under-resourced ethnic studies programs, and inhospitable campus environments. The civil rights and Black power movements had left many promises unfulfilled. For the students of color, the anti-apartheid movement unlocked the connections between their campus struggles and those in their communities. And the South African shanty towns revealed the links between the global and the local. By the late 1980s, the activists had transformed the anti-apartheid movement into a broad anti-racist movement, calling for ethnic studies departments and course requirements, culturally sensitive student programming and faculty, staff and graduate student diversity. The cry was for greater, truer representation that would remove the invisibility of non-whites and counterbalance the Eurocentric bias of the university. By 1988, Yale student organizer Matthew Countryman could say, "I don't think we will ever be in a situation again where divestment will be the sole focus. Rather, it will be part of a range of activities dealing with the university's involvement with racism." Reaction and victory. The anti-apartheid movement provoked particularly violent reactions from the right. At Dartmouth, conservative students cheered a nighttime sledgehammer attack on the shanties and the shanty dwellers. Stanford's shanty town was similarly destroyed, and at University of Utah and Johns Hopkins University, they were set ablaze. In April 1986, shantytown protests at Yale and Berkeley ended with police destroying the camps and beating peaceful demonstrators bloody. In an odd way, American university administrators, police, and right-wingers were reenacting the daily violence of the townships and strengthening public sympathy for the protesters. But the tide of protests in South Africa, the United States, and around the world were having an effect. Months after the Mandela Hall takeover, Columbia University trustees divested. On July 18th, the University of California divested its 3.1 billion South African portfolio, an amount more than portfolios of all the other 130 plus divested universities combined. In August, the state of California voted to divest 11 billion of stock, perhaps the single largest one-time global disinvestment ever. Emboldened, Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which banned any new investment in South Africa except to Black-owned firms and ended arms sales and military aid. When an angered Reagan vetoed the bill, Congress successfully voted to override his veto. It was a stunning rebuke to Reagan and the anti-apartheid tolerant Cold War right, and the apartheid tolerant Cold War right. In 1990, after nearly 3 decades behind bars, Nelson Mandela, the man that the Reaganites and right-wingers had once called a racial terrorist, was released from jail. 4 years later, he stood as the first elected Black president of the country, and he paid tribute to American anti-apartheid activists by consciously evoking the memory of Dr. King. Free at last, free at last. But in America, all the energy, young and old, white, Black, brown, yellow, and red, that had been mustered over 3 decades to fight segregation would slowly disperse. The end of apartheid would be remembered as one of the century's last great victories in the American struggle for desegregation. Nothing would be so stark or clear after this. So, when I think of that, again, it's a reminder of where we've been and what we're capable of when we unite as a people. Now, for Americans to really catch on to the plight of, apartheid South Africa, that actually took a couple of decades. It wasn't just, the 80s and then things changed. But again, it's very similar to where we are now in this global rise of white supremacy and fascism. And, certain countries where there are divestment movements, obviously, the Palestinian people and, the boycott, divest, sanction movement, which has been demonized in the US. And you can see, when you look at passages like that, you can see why, because divestment is powerful. And when, the last thing they want, their strategic military partner, the Israeli government, the right-wing Israeli government, is to let something like that catch on again, even though the world, the international community pretty universally condemns the occupation of Palestinians by the Israeli government. So there's one example. But again, you also see parallels with this idea of white people dominating a lot of these movements on the ground, but also, or losing some of that dominance in movements on the ground, but they're not being so smooth. I mean, we're here in Portland, we've seen it on the ground. We see it to this day, where there's this struggle between, white people, even on the progressive end, who they don't want to let go of that power. And a bunch of, Black, brown people in these movements who we're not gonna sit here and just be like, yeah, it's fine. But, white supremacy with a benign twist is cool. No. So it's a lot of hard conversations, and it's a lot of inner struggles. And, again, a little bit today, I'm going to be hosting a discussion on, how we can use storytelling to kind of maybe curb some of that infighting. But it again raises the question, how do we use all the tools in the toolbox to connect our struggles, to work together, knowing that in order to get there, that means working through some hard stuff. That means, working through internalized white supremacy here. That means working through, the nationalism that we've allowed to just bake into ourselves. A lot of the fascist messaging that we've just subconsciously taken on and questioning ourselves right now, so that we can connect not just with each other here, but globally, because we're fighting against machines. We're fighting against, systems, institutions. And the real advantage we have is people power. But that people power has to be intentional. It has to actually build bonds, it has to actually build trust and strengthen that trust. So that takes work. And, you know, again, you look at this, you look at the movements, the anti-apartheid movement, especially how it, really gained a lot of power in the US in the 80s. They're templates for this. But one, we have to listen to a podcast. I can't remember the person's name who was talking about doing a documentary on the 80s generation because it doesn't get celebrated. But it's one, it's making sure we keep these stories alive and keep these templates alive and pass it down because, again, those in power, I don't think it's a coincidence that we don't talk about exactly how apartheid in South Africa was, how we challenged it, how there's a lot of pressure put on by this divestment movement. I think it's a very purposeful reason. So we don't, do the same thing with, institutions like the Israeli government. So again, we gotta study this. We gotta make these connections. We gotta, start broadening our perspective and using our coalitions to really challenge and overtake these oppressive systems. So with that, in this episode of the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, and see you on the next video.